Now that we've talked a bit about sound sources and different control modules, let's get to the real meat of this series and talk about audio effects. Today, we'll start with distortion and saturation. There are two different ways to approach the nature of a sound that are tightly tied together. You can define a sound by the harmonics that are combined to build it, describing what harmonics and inharmonics are in it and at which level. That's the principle of additive synthesis, for example, where we build a sound by adding harmonics. Or you can define a sound by its waveform, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. The two are very much related, as adding or removing harmonics will change the waveform, and changing the waveform of an oscillator will change its harmonic content. We talked a little bit about this in the second episode of Music Theory in 5 minutes, if you haven't seen it already. To carve your sound by affecting the waveform directly, you can, for example, use a wavetable synth like Serum that allows you to directly draw the shape of your oscillator. Just click on the pencil icon on the top right corner of an oscillator and it will take you to the editing window. But that can be a little fiddly if you don't know where to start or where you want to go with it. So another way to affect the shape of the waveform of an oscillator is to use a waveshaper. Here I am using the Veggie Waveshaper, which is a free Max for Live module for Ableton Live. A waveshaper is an effect that does exactly what the name lets suppose. It takes an incoming signal and changes its shape based on a function. Generally, a waveshaper's function can be represented on an XY graphic. Here, the voltage of the incoming signal is represented on the x-axis, and the voltage of the output signal is on the y-axis. The shaping function is then represented in the graph in the center. For example, a graph that ramps up from -1 to 1 will leave the waveform unchanged. An input of -1 will output a value of -1, an input of 0 will output 0, and an input of 1 will output a value of 1. A graph that ramps down from 1 to -1 will invert the phase of the waveform, as an input of -1 will output a value of 1, an input of 0 will output 0, and an input of 1 will output a value of -1. The graph being a straight line, it won't change the shape of the waveform though. These are very simple examples, but with a waveshaper you can do many things. For example, you can emulate many types of saturation. So to explore that further, let's see how a saturation works. Basically, when you boost the amplitude of a signal, the sound gets louder. But when the amplitude of the signal exceeds the maximal range, the tip of the waveform gets clipped, resulting in a distorted sound. And this is what saturation is. This can be replicated with a waveshaper, with this kind of curve, with hard corners where the curve meets the maximal and minimal values of the graph. In this example, every part of the incoming signal that is below -0.5 will be flattened at -1, and every part that is above 0.5 will be flattened at 1. You can then make the effect even more drastic by boosting the amplitude of the incoming signal or by bringing these 2 points closer to the middle, making the slope in the center steeper. To make the distortion more subtle and sound a little more analog, we can get rid of these hard edges where the signal gets clipped and replace it by a curve. The smoother the curve, the softer the saturation. So there are two main parameters we can play with to make a saturation effect more or less extreme. One is the size of the curve, the wider the smoother, and the tinier up to no curve at all, the more aggressive the sound. And the other is how much we boost the signal beforehand, which is often referred as the drive or gain on a saturation effect. It can also be translated by the steepness of the slope in the center. The more vertical, the more drastic the effect. And all the terms used for different types of saturation are different combinations of these parameters. From the smoothest to the more extreme, there's the analog warmth or analog boost, with a very smooth slope that barely distorts the waveform. Then the overdrive or tube that offers a gentle distortion, often used in blues for example. Then the distortion with a harder curve that provides a much more distorted sound, used a lot in rock and hard rock for example. And above that are the fuzz pedals that really squash the signal with a hard curve. This is used a lot in hard rock and metal music for instance. And at the end of the spectrum is the digital clipping with no slope at all, which gives a very harsh sound. But the more extreme you go with the distortion, the more harmonics are added to the sound, which can work well for subtractive synthesis, so harder distortions often go well in pair with filters. This is also why saturation effects are often used with sub-basses. If the sub is too low for some speakers, you can add harmonics to it, so you can hear them better on smaller equipment. Full disclosure, these are only the basic differences between all these types of saturation. There are a lot of other things that can make several saturation effects sound different. Would they be digital effect or analog pedals? Some of the things have to do with how components like diodes would react in the circuit, which can be emulated digitally, but it's not in the scope of this video as it can get very specific, and I am not an expert on that myself. Other differences have to do with the sampling rate, which we'll see more in detail when we talk about bit crushers, but one of the things I'd like to talk about is symmetry. The types of distortion we've seen so far are symmetrical. They distort the upper side of the signal in the same way than the lower side. But you can distort the higher part differently than the lower part to make them asymmetrical, which can give a different color to the distortion. This is often used to distort the waveform very hardly on one side while having it very smooth on the other side. This way you could achieve a very hard distortion that keeps a certain clarity or a certain warmth. This type of distortion is often associated with tube distortion. And there are two ways to achieve this asymmetrical distortion. One is to have a curve that is different on the lower part than in the higher part, and the other is to offset the incoming signal before it reaches the waveshaper or the distortion effect. If the waveform is offset upward, the upper part of the signal will be clipped before the lower part, resulting in an asymmetric distortion. Let me show you one trick to do that in Ableton Live so you can try it with other saturation effects. Say you have an oscillator here that could be anything, and it goes into a waveshaper. The trick is to put this oscillator in an instrument track and create a second channel. In this second chain, put an operator and use only one oscillator with a fixed frequency of 0 Hz. So it won't oscillate at all, it will just add a steady positive or negative voltage to the signal. And to control how much of this voltage is added, you can use the starting point parameter here. So the oscillator will start at a different point of the waveform and stay there. This way you can control how much you offset the signal, defining how asymmetric the saturation will be. This type of asymmetry is used a lot with fuzz distortions, so you can play with that and see if you find something cool. So there we talked a lot about saturations, and there's a lot you can do with this to model your sound. But that's still one facet of the waveshaper, which can do much more. And there is one last type of wave shaping I would like to talk about, and that is the sine fold function, also often called wavefolding. Visually on a waveshaper, the sine fold function looks like this. It's like a sine wave that goes back and forth between the top and the bottom of the graph. What it does is that instead of clipping the top and the bottom of the waveform when it hits the maximum threshold, it folds it back on itself, hence the name, wavefolding. It is a type of distortion that can create a very harsh, metallic tone by adding a ton of harmonics to the sound. Because it adds so much harmonic content, it can make it a good candidate to use as a starting point for subtractive synthesis. You can use it with a low-pass filter that moves along with an LFO to create a dubstep wobble, for example. And you can make the sound even harsher by reducing the slope at the top and the bottom of the sine shape to make it look like a triangular wave. And the more back and forth the curve does on the waveshaper's graph, the more times you can fold back the incoming signal before saturating the effect. A similar waveform transformation you can do is having a curve that looks like this. With this type of curve, the bottom half of the waveform will stay unchanged, but the top half will be flipped on its head. This type of distortion is often called rectify in some synth and plugins. Now, something I like to try is to add several distortion effects in a chain. It works better if the distortions are different. Layering two different distortions is something you'll see a lot in the design of heavy guitar tones, for example. The idea is that because every distortion will add harmonics, I would put a low-pass filter after each one. So each distortion will distort the sound a little, then I filter out the higher harmonics, then I distort it a little further, rinse and repeat. Here is an example of a sound I made with Ableton Saturation in its waveshaper mode. With all this, you can design your own distortion effects, creating different saturations and wavefolds with different curves in the waveshaper or using presets you have at your disposal. Don't hesitate to draw random shapes as well. Random is always fun. While editing this video, I'd like to add a couple of things. With a graph in the shape of steps, you can create a bit crusher effect. We'll see bit crushers in a dedicated video, but I thought it was important enough to mention it. Also, a saturation reduces the dynamic of a sound. As we basically turn the volume up until the signal hits a wall, the quieter parts of the sound will be brought up and be closer in volume to the louder parts. So we can use it to make discrete things in the sound more prominent or to squash several sounds together and make new textures appear. Like if we play several sine waves together at different pitches, they'll go in and out of sync. Due to phase cancellation, it will make the sound appear and disappear. Well, you can make that more obvious with a saturation. This is the principle used to create Reese bases. Several sawtooth waves are detuned, then filtered to keep only the low end, and then distorted together. The phase cancellation creates the movement that is particular to these Reese bases. Another common move is to play a sine wave with white noise and crush them together with a saturation to create a textured bass. There's one last question I would like to answer before I wrap up this video. The last but not the least. Where can we find these waveshapers in Ableton Live, Serum and VCV Rack? In Ableton Live, the saturator effect shows the curve used for each preset, and with the last one, called Waveshaper, you can access several parameters to design your own curve. If you want more control to design your own curves, I like the Veggie Waveshaper, which is a Max for Live device that you can download for free. It allows you to add as many points as you like, use curves, you have symmetric and asymmetric modes, and you can lock the first and last points if you don't want them to move. Or you can snap the points you add to a grid for more precision. It is very cool and certified without meat. In Serum, in the Effect tab, the distortion effect also displays a graph, which shows the curve used for each preset. It's interesting to see that the drive knob on this plugin doesn't amplify the incoming signal, but changes the shape of the curve instead. In the preset list, you have X-shape presets, in which you can draw your own curves directly by clicking on one of those two buttons here. There is a symmetric mode in which the graph represents only the top part of the curve, or an asymmetric mode in which this represents the whole curve. In these X-shape modes, the drive knob still doesn't amplify the input signal, but it is more of a transfer knob between the shape of the curve A and the curve B. Then in VCV Rack, I haven't found a waveshaper that allows you to draw your own curves in this way. Instead, there are waveshapers with various presets to choose from. My two favorites among the ones that I've tried are the Wavecoast Waveshaper by Lindenberg Research and Shaper by Squinky Labs. And that's all for today, so thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon in the next one.